Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 277 of the podcast. It is March 23rd, 2017. Joining me today is Kay Kendall. She is co-author with Glenn Bodinson of the excellent book titled Leading the Malcolm Baldrige Way, How World-Class Leaders Align Their Organizations to Deliver Exceptional Results. Kay is CEO and principal at an organization called BaldrigeCoach. Since 1989, BaldrigeCoach has worked with organizations across every sector, large and small, to use the Baldrige framework to create focus, align empowered employees, provide high-quality products and services, deliver exceptional customer experience, and achieve enviable results. So in this episode, we'll talk about the book. We'll discuss Kay's background in manufacturing and quality, her experience with the Baldrige approach, and the ways that Lean and Baldrige are complementary. If you'd like to find the page for this episode with links to the book and more, you can go to leanblog.org/277. Well, again, our guest is Kay Kendall. Kay, thank you for being a guest on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy that you had invited me.
So, we're talking about the book, Leading the Malcolm Baldrige Way, and we're going to get into some related topics. Before talking about the book, can you introduce yourself and your background for the listeners?
I spent more than 20 years in corporate America, mostly as an executive leading quality organizations, but I've been involved with the Baldrige program since the early 1990s. Became an examiner, have been an examiner for several state programs as well as other Baldrige-related programs, served as a judge for 3 years for the Baldrige program, and I continue to serve as an alumni. I think it's just an incredible framework that helps organizations of all sizes, and I've been doing consulting with organizations and using the framework since 2009.
And, I think we'll have a chance here for you to give an overview of the Baldrige program for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with it. But I'd be curious to hear a little bit more. What industries did you work in before getting involved with Baldrige, or even as you got involved with Baldrige?
I started out in pharmaceuticals, and then I spent 15 years in aerospace, then worked in semiconductor automation equipment, and then my last job in corporate America was with Sun Microsystems, which is now Oracle.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, what made you interested in quality as something to work on? What was, interesting or hopefully exciting to you about working in quality?
Well, it's to me, it's the best of both worlds because it has a clear customer focus. But if you do it right, it also really is a way that you can engage people in their own jobs, improving their own work.
Yeah, and can you give an overview of the Baldrige approach and maybe in your explanation of that, talk about how you got introduced or involved with it?
Well, the Baldrige is a framework. It's non-prescriptive. It can apply to any type of organization, any size organization. It has 7 categories. The first 6 are process categories, and they deal with leadership, strategic planning, customers, measurement and knowledge management, workforce, and operations. And the 7th category is all about results. And it's really arranged in sort of a balanced scorecard approach to look at results. A lot of people that only know the Baldrige Award from its early days of being a national quality award really are surprised to find out that there are 1,000 points possible, but 450 points are reserved for the results category. So anybody who thinks that it's just a kinder, gentler way of doing business really hasn't looked at the criteria in recent days to see that it really is very much focused on the business, achieving the objectives of the business. I first got introduced to Baldrige when I was working at Allied Signal. Our chief quality officer had come from Xerox, where he had led their Baldrige winning application project. And he held the first internal Baldrige examiner course at Allied Signal, and I was in that. and I was absolutely smitten. I just had never had a management model that to me was so encompassing without having that prescriptive nature to it. And I tried to become a Baldrige examiner the following year, didn't get in. Jim, the chief quality officer, encouraged me to become an examiner for the state program, which I did. And then the following year I was accepted as a Baldrige examiner. And I continued to do the state program for a few years too, because, as I said, I was smitten.
Yeah. Now, can you kind of explain a little bit some of the background and the difference today between the national award? My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it originated out of the federal government, I think the Department of Commerce, and then it has sort of evolved and spread to include state level awards. Can you kind of talk about a little bit of that history?
Well, it actually was an interesting public-private partnership and initially had no funding. It was housed in the standards NIST because they had a strong history of partnering with business, but were very apolitical. It has subsequently lost funding, but has, again, a very strong support. There's a foundation, and we all hope at some point that it will be funded again because it really does bring so much competitive advantage to organizations in the U.S. It also then did spawn into several other Baldrige-based programs in states, in regions, also in some industries. So, for instance, the long-term care program has a Baldrige-based award program. The housing, construction industry also does. So it's also been replicated around the world. At last I checked, there were something like more than 70 countries or regions around the world that have Baldrige-based programs.
Interesting. And are there programs in all 50 states, or just certain states where those have been established?
There are programs that cover all but 2 states currently.
Okay. Well, for those who regularly listen to the podcast, back in episode 218, about 2 years ago, my guest was Karen Keel-Rosser from a hospital system, health system, Mary Greeley Medical Center in Iowa. Anyone who wants to go back to that episode, you can hear Karen talking about their Baldrige journey and their Baldrige process and how they've combined Lean and Baldrige. I was wondering, Kay, if you could comment a little bit more when you talk about Baldrige being non-prescriptive. Karen talked about that. Lean for them was some of the how. She said Baldrige was the what, Lean was the how. What are some of your thoughts on Lean and Baldrige, or are there other ways of kind of, since Baldrige is non-prescriptive, other methodologies or other ways that people can define the how?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the culture of the organization and the type of work that they do. I know Karen very well. We work with them on their Baldrige journey as well, and I've been very impressed with what they've been able to accomplish with Lean, and I know that you've worked with them too, so it's kind of a nice point of overlap for us.
Right.
So let me tell you why I think that there's some issues around the culture of an organization. We work with a lot of long-term care clients, and even more so than a hospital or healthcare system, it's very, very difficult for them to do what I'll call continuous and traditional process improvement like Lean, like total quality. And the reason is they have very, very, pardon the pun, very, very lean staffing. And these are folks that are on the floor constantly giving care. And so the idea of doing what many of us are familiar with, which is pulling people aside, having a Kaizen event, pulling people aside and having meetings in conference rooms, is just not very practical for them. So for them, using some of the tools, even something as simple as PDCA, and teaching them some of the basic quality tools like fishbone diagrams, basic charting, that gives them a lot of leverage, and it's very appropriate for their setting. Where you have organizations that are not so resource constrained in terms of staffing, and also, quite frankly, in terms of some education. Some of the people that work in long-term care, they have the best hearts in the world, and they give terrific care, but many of them don't have extensive education. So any kinds of methodologies that require a lot of math, a lot of analysis, is not going to be something that's going to be comfortable for them. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
It might be a long-winded way, but
No, it's okay. Well, I have to come back to so when you said talking about the pun of quote unquote lean staffing, I'm sure we're in agreement that lean the methodology isn't about being understaffed. It's about having the right staffing levels to be able to do the right work. There's a whole different podcast about challenges with that word lean. But when we talk about improving quality and engaging people, I mean, I think we could do that in so many different ways, whether we use really deep mathematical statistical methods, or if we try to get everyone to speak up to point out problems and test solutions in that PDSA or PDCA style. One other question that comes to mind, though, Kay, when you talk about culture, how much of the Baldrige process, for, let's say, an organization like Mary Greeley or others getting recognition at a state or federal level, how much of that process is about recognizing organizations that are already doing a really good job with quality, and how much of this process is about organizations being able to take pretty big steps forward in that journey?
Well, the Baldrige Award isn't about being pretty good. It really is a standard of excellence across a variety of dimensions. So it's very intentional. That's one of the things in the book that we wrote recently that really surprised us. We never asked any of the executives that we interviewed a single question about culture, but every single executive we talked to talked about culture and how they intentionally designed the culture that they wanted their organizations to have, and how they reinforced that in various ways.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that is? That's interesting that the process wouldn't ask about culture. Why is that? Is that because culture is more of a result than something like a lever you directly pull? Or tell me more about that.
Well, the criteria actually does ask about culture, and it asks in several places about how senior leaders help to shape the culture. It also asks the organizations to describe their cultures. I think the difference is they're not, the criteria doesn't prescribe a set culture. So I'll give you, for instance, I've been on multiple site visits with the Baldrige program and with other programs. Every organization that I visited that was a recipient or close to being a recipient had what we sometimes call a palpable culture, but they were very different cultures. Mm-hmm. But in each of them, the workforce was incredibly engaged. And as you pointed out, they were engaged in different ways, but in offering solutions and coming up with ideas. It was a culture of inclusion.
Well, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, whether it's based on Baldrige principles or just your own experience. When we talk about engagement, I hear people far too often complain that their employees aren't engaged, and either in the way they're asking it or in their tone, it sounds like they're blaming the employees for not being engaged, which I think is silly. But what are your views or advice on how to get started in engaging people in quality improvement?
Well, I think one is you have to genuinely respect the people that work for you. Mm-hmm. And I know that we've had some exchanges on Twitter about this. You hear some things that come out of leaders' mouths and you just think, you cringe. Like, that's not your job. Don't worry about that. Even something as simple as we were working with a new client the other day and trying to wonder about getting frontline staff, and this committee that we were meeting with, which is one of their quality improvement committees at a senior level, at our insistence, included some frontline staff in the meeting. And that was kind of horrific to us, realizing that was something we had to encourage them to do rather than something that they thought was natural. So we asked a couple of the people, how long have you worked here? And one said 10 years, the other said 7 years. We said, have you ever been asked for your ideas? And they very bravely said, no.
Right.
And we said, well, you've worked here a long time. Do you have some ways that you think things might be improved? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting and actually good, because there were a lot of chagrined looks around the table. They understood the point we were making.
Yeah.
That you have people that have come in here to work for 7 and 10 years respectively. They're good people, they work hard, and you've never once asked them what they think.
Yeah. And that's sad. And there's this weird catch-22 where I've heard leaders say, well, people should speak up. Like, well, it's not that easy when you're not the boss. I think, going back to Deming, Dr. Deming and others in the quality movement, and I think you touched on this, you always said, quality starts at the top, that leaders need to set the tone in a lot of different ways. And I think part of that tone includes asking other people, to asking them to step forward, and then making it safe for them to do so. I've seen a lot of organizations in recent years that basically kind of, lecture the employees, well, you have an obligation, you should speak up for safety and quality. But the organization demonstrates when people do speak up that it, can be punitive. It can be punitive. It can be damaging to their careers. So, I think it's, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. And sometimes I worked for a boss one time who, the standing joke was, and it wasn't really funny, was that he already knows everything, and if he doesn't know it, it's because it's not worth knowing. But that was his attitude. He was always going to be clearly the smartest guy in the room, and that's really off-putting.
Yeah.
And so and I was an executive at the time, and I can imagine how people, in the front line would have felt about that. I was head of quality, and I had an employee. I was working late one evening, a final inspector, who was getting a lot of grief about passing off a product that shouldn't be shipped. And she came up to my office and asked for my support. Well, later on, when we had an all-staff meeting, I overheard some of her peers kind of teasing her, so I asked her to stay back and talk to me afterwards. And what I said was, "What's carpet land?" And she got this very embarrassed look, and I said, "No, come on, you can tell me. What's carpet land?" That was executive row.
Yep.
Because every place else, it was a manufacturing facility, every place else had linoleum.
Yeah.
And she had actually, in coming to see me, violated one of the unspoken rules, which was, you don't go out to carpet land. And I was crushed when I heard that.
Well, and I've heard similar, almost the exact same story in healthcare, where I was at a hospital system maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and think of the message being sent. The executive offices were in a building that was like quite literally across the street from the hospital. Now, there was a bridge over the street, an enclosed hallway bridge that went across, and one of the management student interns during the graduate program was spending time with us in the lab and on the hospital side of the street. And he was really interested in process improvement, and he was kind of hanging around our project team a lot, and he was trying to learn and contribute and see what was going on. And he came across one day and he said, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be around here as much." He said that his boss, who was a VP of quality, she told him something to the effect of, "Yeah, you're spending too much time across the street, and you shouldn't do that because they have bad attitudes," and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, my.
Well, why do you think they have bad attitudes? It's because, for the most part, the executives were staying on their side of the street. So this is, I think a culture like that is really, really hard to change. If, maybe I think when that management student gets further along in his career, maybe he can lead differently.
Right.
But anyway, sorry to get sidetracked on my story.
Oh,
but,
no.
There's a big need for improvement here. And I was wondering, kind of thinking back to the quality movement, as that phrase was used, maybe in the 80s, total quality management. Dr. Deming was still alive there. We've had some exchanges on Twitter about this, where I hate to be too cynical, but sometimes I think quite literally the war on quality has been lost. That quality has been defeated. That, so many organizations just don't seem to know what they're doing. They don't train their employees, it seems. They don't support them, and we suffer as customers. What are your thoughts on the quality movement? What happened in terms of sort of like this broader business focus? Do you still hear people outside of kind of limited circles talking about quality?
I don't, not nearly as much as I used to. And I'm going to say something that perhaps is a little jaded. I think that, as I said, I worked in aerospace for 15 years. We really had changed the culture dramatically when we introduced total quality management. And we called it total quality leadership. Mm-hmm. And really broke down a lot of the hierarchy that had been existent in that organization and in that industry. And here's where I'm going to sound very jaded. I think we did ourselves a great disservice the way that we implemented Six Sigma. Mm-hmm. The initial master black belts that were trained in a very arrogant way, and they went about bashing everything that was not Six Sigma. So you suddenly went from a very inclusive, it's everybody's job, but not just job, it's everybody's right to improve their own processes, improve their own work, to this elitist view that only if you were a belt did you have the tools and the smarts to improve processes. Yeah. And I saw a real shift in the culture. I think it changed back a little bit for the better when we started implementing some of the lean principles. Right. Because that definitely did get the people that were doing the work involved in improving the work.
Which I think that's a strength of the lean approach. And to your comment, I don't want this to be interpreted as I'm not bashing Six Sigma, but what you say about the arrogance is something that I've run across even very recently. I'm not going to name names here, but one of the guys who claims to be a co-creator of Six Sigma, comes across as really arrogant in his writing and his promotions, and that you should be lucky to come and sit at his feet and learn from him. And that I find off-putting. The lean luminaries that I've had the chance to meet and run across certainly don't have that tone or attitude. So I'm not going to generalize. I'm not generalizing and saying all Six Sigma people are arrogant and all lean people are humble servant leaders. That's of course no generalization's not always going to be true. But I agree with you though that that taking quality improvement out of everybody's hands does a disservice, I think, to those employees and the organizations.
Well, and I didn't want that to come across as bashing either, because I was a master black belt later on in my career. But I think, again, it could be said for any tool, any approach, any methodology. If people come at it with the I'm the expert and you are the idiot, and you should be glad to have me, that's obviously detrimental to a culture that we want to have.
Yeah. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the book. Again, the title is Leading the Malcolm Baldrige Way, How World-Class Leaders Align Their Organizations to Deliver Exceptional Results. How did you and Glenn get started with writing the book? What led to the book?
Well, actually, we were surprised. We were contacted by McGraw-Hill, and they were looking for a book on leadership that related to Malcolm Baldrige. And we have just such a passion around that we put together a proposal and got it accepted, and we're under contract. Our initial premise, which we actually carried through on the book, was a lot of senior leaders, a lot of executives have pretty short attention spans. And just like Baldrige is not one size fits all, we wanted to speak to leaders where they were. So, for instance, we have chapters that talk about dealing with very large organizations, a chapter on dealing with very small organizations. What do you do if you're a leader and you come into an organization that has a culture of entitlement? So it was really intended that leaders could pick up this book and dive into whatever spoke to them. Mm-hmm. And it's really met that need.
And the book was released a couple of months ago. Can you talk about the launch?
In November. It was released in November. Yeah. We've actually had a lot of interest, even internationally. We have a very good friend, a colleague who was a consultant for more than 4 years over in India, working with one of their largest conglomerates, if you will. And it's gotten a lot of attention over there. I actually had a request from somebody in Taiwan to give them information about the book. I'm hoping that we have more American business leaders that also read it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and within the book, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff here. You touch on points in the book how Lean and Baldrige fit together. There's chapter 14 here on lessons learned about the journey. Can you share maybe one of those lessons learned that you shared in the book?
Well, this probably won't surprise you, but it does many people that we talk to. Not one of the senior leaders said, "Gee, I wish we'd waited. I wished we'd waited until we were, quote, ready."
Oh. Mm-hmm.
They all said, I wish we'd gotten started. I wish we'd gotten started earlier. Because it really, even the ones that started out initially with wanting to win the award, at some point in their journey, they shifted from that view to recognizing how much better their organizations were becoming. And one of the executives, the CEO of one of the healthcare systems that was an award recipient, David Tilton, describes his own evolution, where he talked about getting lost in that focus on the award. And he realized what he was doing to the organization and stressing them about that. And he consciously shifted his focus and the way he talked about it to talking about becoming award worthy. And that was the real purpose. And oddly enough, that was the year after he shifted, was the year that they won the award.
Well, it's when you talk about this question, this hand wringing about being ready, I hear the same thing about Kaizen and continuous improvement or Lean, and organizations will plan and research and talk about it and back off and say, "Oh, our culture's not ready for this yet." And I've always I've thought, well, yeah, you're never ready, and don't expect to be perfect at this. You're not going to go from low levels of performance to high performance immediately. You've got to start, and if you're following a continuous improvement mindset, you'll plan, you'll take some steps, you'll do, and you'll study and adjust. And I think that's really good advice. It's interesting that feedback came out of your interviews in the book.
Well, and I think you're right, too, that you don't have to bite off a big chunk. Early small wins are very important. And they don't have to be the knock it out of the park, but small wins that allow people to get a sense of accomplishment, mm-hmm. that allow them to test management's commitment. Those are important.
Yeah. Because I think, when I'm working with people who are new and I'm trying to encourage them or coach them, and a lot of times people kind of hold back and say, "Well, how do I know leadership is serious this time?" I'm like, "Well, I can't prove that. We just, you have to wait and see." And I understand the skepticism of people not wanting to invest time and energy into something that might fade away as they've seen before.
Oh, absolutely, I understand that, and for people that have had senior leaders that didn't have a lot of perseverance with approaches. We heard that from one of the executives that we talked to, the owner, Ken Schnitzer of Park Place Lexus, and all of the dealerships that they have. He said that when they initially embarked on the Baldrige journey, it was met with a lot of skepticism, and he acknowledged that he was the root cause of it. Yeah. He said, because my first 5 or 6 years leading the organization, he said, I didn't really stick with anything. I would try something and abandon, So he said it was natural that they had, skepticism about this. And he said, so I had to really double down and prove that I was serious about it.
So before we wrap up here in a couple of minutes, can you talk about, some of the ways when you talk about mentioning, or you mentioned working with long-term care facilities, other types of organizations. What are some of the ways that you and Glenn help organizations in this Baldrige process?
Well, some of them are interested in submitting an application to either Baldrige or a Baldrige-based program. And even if they're interested in the application support, what we first do is help them by facilitating a self-assessment against the Baldrige framework. Because it doesn't make a lot of sense, even though I talked about getting started, it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to submit an application right off the bat if you have huge gaps in some of the key processes contained within the framework. There are some clients that we work with that they're knowledgeable about the framework. In fact, we're working with one right now where the CEO came from an organization that had won the Baldrige Award. He's very familiar with the framework, but he really doesn't have any desire to go after the award. Mm-hmm. But he has a strong desire to implement the processes, the systems, and the systematic approaches throughout the organization based on the framework. Oh. So we do both. We're really not all about the award, although it's fun to have clients reach that level of excellence and receive that recognition. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of our clients that's featured in the book is the first long-term care facility in the country to ever receive the Baldrige Award. Mm-hmm. So we're always excited when you can kind of take away excuses, because a lot of people will say, oh, we could never compete because we're too small, we're too big, we're too unique. This is a 68-bed facility in rural Idaho, and they have achieved exceptional results year after year after year. So we're thrilled that they can show the long-term care industry that excellence is possible.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I've heard others, even in the context of, let's say, the Shingo Prize, say the value that comes out of that is a framework that challenges you to reevaluate things, getting some outside perspective. I know lots of organizations, some of whom in healthcare, who have used that framework, even though they don't plan on submitting formally to try to get the prize. So I think that's interesting to hear a similar thing about the Baldrige process. So as we wrap up here, again, I encourage people to pick up the book, Leading the Malcolm Baldrige Way. Kay, what are some ways people can find you online if they want to connect with you in social media or contact you about possibly working with them?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. Twitter, my handle is at Kaya Kendall. And then we also have a website, which is www.BaldrigeCoach.com. And the only thing I ask people to remember is Baldrige has only one D, because a lot of people misspell it and they can't find us.
Yeah, I've misspelled it many times, so I've tried to learn. But again, our guest has been Kay Kendall. She is, along with Glenn Bodinson, co-author of a really nice book, Leading the Malcolm Baldrige Way. Kay, do you have any kind of final thought or tip to leave the listeners with?
I would just say, whatever approach it is that you're trying to take your organization to a higher level of performance, whether it's Lean, Baldrige, or some other approach, get started and stay with it.
Great advice, Kay. Thank you for being a guest and spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much, Mark. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.